Carl Jung revealed that empaths can find their true self by following a psychological map that most people never discover. Not through meditation, not through therapy, not even through years of spiritual seeking. Jung found that empaths possess a unique psychological advantage for individuation, but only if they understand the one shadow pattern that's been keeping them lost in everyone else's emotional world. Picture this moment. You're sitting alone after absorbing someone's heavy emotions all day, a friend's anxiety, a co-worker's frustration, your family's unspoken tension. You feel drained, confused about what's actually yours. You can sense everyone else's inner world with startling clarity, but when you try to connect with your own authentic self, there's just emptiness. Jung spent decades studying what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are beneath all the masks and projections. But he discovered that empaths face a unique challenge. Your greatest gift becomes your greatest obstacle to self-discovery. And once you understand Jung's map, you'll never lose yourself in other people's emotions again. This isn't another spiritual bypass or toxic positivity approach. It's a psychological roadmap that reveals the deepest truths about empathic consciousness. And by the end of this journey, you'll not only reclaim your authentic self, but you'll understand how to use your sensitivity as a superpower rather than a burden. But here's what makes Jung's discovery so disturbing for empaths. Your ability to feel everyone else's emotions isn't just a gift. It's been unconsciously programming you to abandon your own authentic self. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Your empathic nature creates what I call emotional fusion, a psychological state where your boundaries become so permeable that you literally lose track of where you end and others begin. You've been absorbing not just emotions, but entire identity fragments from every person you encounter. Jung understood that empaths face a unique version of what he called the persona problem. While most people wear masks to hide their true selves from others, you've been wearing masks to hide your true self from yourself. Every time you prioritize someone else's emotional needs over your own inner voice, you strengthen the false persona and weaken your connection to what Jung called the self. The real tragedy isn't that you feel too much. It's that you've been taught to believe that feeling everything makes you more spiritual, more evolved, more compassionate. But Jung discovered something that will shatter this illusion. True compassion can only flow from an integrated self, not from a fragmented empath who's lost in other people's emotional chaos. Jung's first insight about empathic individuation centers on what I call the empathic shadow, the parts of yourself you've rejected because they don't fit the sensitive healer identity. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Here's the shadow pattern most empaths refuse to face: your need to be needed. Deep in your unconscious lurks a part of you that secretly enjoys being the emotional savior, the one everyone turns to in crisis. This shadow aspect manipulates through martyrdom, controls through caretaking, and maintains superiority through suffering. You've probably never acknowledged this, but there's a part of you that feels special because you can feel what others can't. A part that gets narcissistic supply from being the chosen one who absorbs everyone's pain. Jung would call this your wounded healer complex, where your identity becomes so tied to healing others that you unconsciously create situations where people need your emotional rescue. But here's where it gets darker. Your empathic shadow also contains your rage, years of suppressed anger at having your boundaries violated, your needs ignored, your authentic self buried under everyone else's emotional demands. You've been taught that anger isn't spiritual, so you've pushed it into the unconscious, where it festers and manifests as passive aggression, victim consciousness, and what Jung called emotional possession. Jung observed that the healthy man does not torture others. Generally, it is the tortured who turn into torturers. Your shadow contains the potential to use your empathic gifts as weapons. You can manipulate through guilt, control through emotional overwhelm, and punish through withdrawal of your healing presence. The most dangerous aspect of the empathic shadow is projection. You unconsciously cast your disowned anger onto others, seeing them as toxic or narcissistic, while failing to recognize these same patterns operating within yourself. You become what Jung called a shadow hunter, obsessively focused on identifying darkness in others while remaining blind to your own. If you've ever secretly enjoyed being the only one who truly understands someone's pain, comment, "I was their chosen healer." This shadow acknowledgement isn't about shame, it's about integration. Jung taught that the shadow, once conscious, becomes a source of authentic power rather than unconscious manipulation. Jung's second insight reveals how empaths become trapped in what I call the sensitive persona, a false identity built around being emotionally available to everyone except yourself. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Your persona as the empathic healer seems noble, but it's actually a sophisticated defense mechanism. You've learned that being sensitive and selfless earns you love, approval, and a sense of purpose. But this persona requires you to constantly monitor and manage other people's emotional states while neglecting your own. Jung discovered that the stronger your persona, the more your authentic self goes underground. You begin living what I call empathic performance, constantly scanning the room for emotional disturbances, automatically adjusting your energy to soothe others, reflexively absorbing tension without even realizing it. The terrible irony is that your empathic persona actually disconnects you from genuine empathy. True empathy requires clear boundaries, knowing where you end and others begin. But your persona creates what Jung called emotional fusion, where you lose yourself in other people's psychological states. Here's how the trap works. Every time you successfully calm someone's anxiety or absorb their anger, you get a hit of validation that reinforces the persona. You start believing that your worth depends on your ability to emotionally regulate others. Jung called this the helper's high, a form of psychological addiction that keeps you trapped in codependent patterns. But the persona demands a sacrifice, your authentic emotional expression. You learn to suppress your own needs, minimize your own pain, and prioritize everyone else's feelings above your own inner truth. Jung wrote, "The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering." Your legitimate suffering includes the grief of not being seen for who you really are, the rage at having your boundaries constantly violated, and the terror of discovering what's left when you stop being everyone's emotional caretaker. The persona protects you from these painful truths, but it also prevents you from accessing your authentic power. Jung understood that persona breakdown is inevitable. There comes a moment when the false self can no longer sustain itself, when the emotional fusion becomes too exhausting, when the performance feels more like prison than purpose. This breakdown isn't pathology, it's the psyche's attempt to return you to your true self. The question isn't whether your empathic persona will collapse, but whether you'll have the courage to meet your authentic self when it does. You've likely suspected that Jung's map for empathic individuation requires what I call conscious separation, the psychological process of differentiating your authentic self from the emotional fusion you've been living in. Jung wrote, "Individuality is the opposite of being a member of a group, an institution, a race, or a nation." Your experience has probably shown you that individuation means learning to distinguish between your emotions and absorbed emotions, between genuine intuition and anxious hypervigilance, between authentic compassion and codependent caretaking. This process terrifies most empaths because it feels like betraying your core identity. You've likely encountered Jung's 4 stages of empathic individuation in your own journey. First comes shadow integration, consciously acknowledging your need to be needed, your anger at boundary violations, and your secret superiority complex about being more sensitive than others. This stage feels like dying because you're dismantling the identity that's earned you love and purpose. Second is persona dissolution, deliberately letting go of the role as everyone's emotional caretaker. Jung called this the dark night of the soul for empaths, because without the constant drama of other people's problems, you're forced to face the emptiness you've been avoiding. You discover that you don't actually know who you are when you're not fixing someone. Your deeper awareness recognizes the third stage, what Jung called active imagination, learning to dialogue with your own unconscious instead of constantly processing other people's psychological material. This means paying attention to your dreams, honoring your own emotional needs, and developing what I call internal empathy, the ability to feel and validate your own inner experience. The fourth stage is self-realization, the emergence of what Jung called the transcendent function. This is where you develop the capacity to feel deeply without losing yourself, to help others without abandoning your own needs, to be sensitive without being porous. You've probably intuited Jung's warning that individuation isn't a linear process. He wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. You don't solve your empathic challenges, you develop a larger container that can hold both your sensitivity and your sovereignty." Comment if you've started setting boundaries and people called you selfish. I chose myself for the first time. Your wisdom recognizes that empathic individuation requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. You must learn to be both open and boundaried, both compassionate and self-protective, both sensitive and strong. This isn't about becoming less empathic. It's about becoming a conscious empath rather than an unconscious emotional sponge. Jung's most profound insight about empaths involves your connection to what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of humanity. Jung wrote, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul." Your empathic sensitivity isn't just picking up individual emotions. You're unconsciously accessing archetypal patterns that Jung identified as universal human experiences. What I call archetypal empathy explains why you sometimes feel overwhelmed in crowds, why certain people trigger inexplicable reactions, and why you can sense things about people that they haven't told you. Jung discovered that empaths are unconsciously channeling what he called archetypal energies, universal patterns like the mother, the warrior, the victim, the savior. When someone activates the victim archetype around you, your unconscious automatically responds by activating the savior archetype. You think you're being compassionate, but you're actually being possessed by an unconscious pattern. This archetypal possession explains why your empathic responses often feel compulsive rather than conscious. You're not choosing to absorb someone's anxiety, you're unconsciously resonating with the collective anxiety that particular person is carrying. Jung called this participation mystique, a psychological state where you lose individual consciousness and become absorbed into collective psychological patterns. But here's Jung's revolutionary insight. Your empathic sensitivity can become a doorway to individuation rather than an obstacle to it. When you learn to consciously work with archetypal energies, instead of being unconsciously possessed by them, you develop what I call sacred empathy, the ability to help others without losing yourself. Jung taught that dreams are the primary way the collective unconscious communicates with individual consciousness. For empaths, dreams often contain guidance about how to maintain your authentic self while honoring your sensitive nature. Pay attention to dreams where you're setting boundaries, saying no, or protecting yourself. These are messages from your individuating psyche. The collective unconscious also speaks through what Jung called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that guide you toward individuation. When you start setting boundaries, you might notice that healthier people suddenly appear in your life. When you begin honoring your own needs, you might find opportunities that support your authentic self-expression. Jung wrote, "Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious." For empaths, this means becoming conscious of which archetypal patterns you're unconsciously carrying for others. Are you being possessed by the mother archetype, compulsively nurturing everyone around you? Are you channeling the wounded healer, staying stuck in your own pain to help others process theirs? If you've noticed that certain people consistently trigger the same response in you, comment, "I see the pattern now." The goal isn't to stop feeling archetypal energies. It's to develop conscious choice about when and how you engage with them. Jung called this active imagination, the ability to dialogue with archetypal forces instead of being overwhelmed by them. Jung's ultimate test for empathic individuation involves what I call the integration challenge, your ability to maintain authentic selfhood while remaining genuinely empathic. Jung wrote, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life." This integration isn't about becoming less sensitive, it's about developing what Jung called conscious empathy versus unconscious emotional absorption. Conscious empathy means you choose when to open your emotional boundaries and when to maintain them. You feel others' pain without taking it on as your own. You offer support without sacrificing your own well-being. The integration test comes in 3 phases. First is boundary consciousness, learning to distinguish between your emotions and absorbed emotions in real time. This requires developing what I call emotional sovereignty, the ability to say, "This feeling belongs to someone else," and consciously return it without guilt or drama. Jung discovered that integrated empaths develop what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension. You can be both vulnerable and protected, both open-hearted and boundaried, both caring and detached. This isn't about being cold or disconnected. It's about being authentically present without losing yourself. The second phase is authentic response, learning to respond from your true self rather than from empathic programming. Instead of automatically trying to fix everyone's emotional states, you develop the courage to let people have their own experiences. Jung called this loving detachment, caring about someone without being responsible for their healing. This phase terrifies most empaths because you've been conditioned to believe that not absorbing someone's pain means you don't care about them. But Jung taught that taking on others' emotions actually prevents them from developing their own emotional resilience. Your absorption becomes enabling rather than healing. The third phase is sacred service, learning to serve others from wholeness rather than woundedness. Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct, acting from inner necessity." When you serve from your authentic self, rather than from empathic compulsion, your gifts become truly transformative. Integrated empaths develop what I call witnessing presence, the ability to hold space for others' experiences without absorbing them, to offer wisdom without attachment to outcomes, to love without losing themselves. This is the difference between being an emotional sponge and being a lighthouse. Jung understood that true empathic service requires self-possession. You can't give what you don't have, and you can't hold space for others if you're not holding space for yourself. The integration process teaches you that self-care isn't selfish. It's the foundation of authentic empathy. The ultimate integration test is whether you can maintain your center while others are in emotional chaos, whether you can offer genuine support without abandoning your own needs, whether you can be fully present without disappearing into others' experiences. Comment if you've learned to feel others' pain without taking it on as your own. I witness, but don't absorb. Jung's individuation map becomes practical through what I call empathic alchemy, the conscious transformation of your sensitivity from a burden into a superpower. Jung wrote, "We don't really heal anything, we simply let it go." The first practice is emotional sorting, learning to identify which emotions belong to you and which you've absorbed. Every morning, scan your emotional state and ask, what am I feeling that's actually mine? You'll be shocked to discover how much of your daily emotional experience belongs to other people. Jung taught that consciousness begins with observation. Create what I call an empathy journal, where you track your emotional states throughout the day. Notice which people consistently drain your energy, which environments overwhelm your system, and which situations trigger your empathic absorption. Patterns will emerge that reveal your unconscious empathic programming. The second practice is boundary rituals, physical and energetic practices that help you maintain emotional sovereignty. Jung understood that the body holds psychological patterns, so you need somatic practices to support individuation. This might include visualization exercises, where you imagine a protective boundary around yourself, or physical movements that help you discharge absorbed emotions. Create what I call empathic transitions, conscious rituals between interactions that help you clear absorbed energy and reconnect with your authentic self. This could be as simple as washing your hands while imagining you're releasing others' emotions, or taking 3 deep breaths to reconnect with your own center. The third practice is authentic expression, learning to honor your own emotional needs instead of constantly prioritizing others. Jung wrote, "To be normal is the ultimate aim of the unsuccessful." Your empathic nature makes you abnormal in the healthiest way possible, but only if you embrace your authentic expression rather than trying to fit conventional expectations. Start small by expressing preferences that you've been suppressing. If you don't want to go to a social event because you're emotionally depleted, say no without elaborate explanations. If someone's energy feels draining, limit your exposure without guilt. Jung called this ethical egoism, taking care of yourself not from selfishness, but from recognition that your well-being serves the greater good. The fourth practice is shadow work, consciously engaging with the parts of yourself you've rejected. Jung taught that integration requires befriending your shadow rather than trying to eliminate it. Acknowledge your need to be needed, your anger at boundary violations, and your superiority complex about being more evolved than others. Comment if you've started expressing your needs without apology. My voice matters too. Jung understood that practical application of individuation principles must be gentle and gradual. You're rewiring decades of empathic programming, which requires patience and self-compassion. The goal isn't perfection, it's conscious choice about how you engage your empathic gifts. Jung's shadow work reveals what I call the dark empath, the unconscious ways your sensitivity can become destructive when it's not integrated. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul." Here's the shadow truth most empaths refuse to acknowledge. Your emotional absorption can become a form of psychological vampirism. When you're constantly processing other people's emotional states, you're unconsciously feeding off their psychological energy. You become addicted to emotional drama because it gives you a sense of purpose and aliveness. Jung identified this pattern as emotional possession, where you lose your individual consciousness and become consumed by collective emotional states. You start unconsciously creating or attracting emotional crises because without them, you feel empty and directionless. Your identity becomes so dependent on being needed that you sabotage your own happiness to maintain your role as the wounded healer. The dark empath also uses sensitivity as a weapon. You manipulate through emotional overwhelm, control through victim consciousness, and punish through withdrawal of your healing presence. Jung called this psychological poisoning, where your unintegrated shadow contaminates your empathic gifts. You might unconsciously exaggerate your emotional reactions to gain attention, dramatize your sensitivity to avoid responsibility, or use your empathic insights to manipulate others' behavior. The shadow empath becomes what Jung called a false prophet, someone who claims to serve healing while actually perpetuating dysfunction. But the darkest aspect of unintegrated empathy is projection. You unconsciously cast your disowned selfishness onto others, seeing them as narcissistic, while failing to recognize your own narcissistic need to be the special, chosen healer. You become obsessed with identifying toxic people, while remaining blind to your own toxic patterns. Jung taught that shadow projection always involves what he called the inferior function, the psychological capacities you've least developed. For many empaths, this includes healthy aggression, appropriate selfishness, and the ability to maintain boundaries without guilt. You project these disowned qualities onto others, and then try to heal or fix them, which is actually an unconscious attempt to integrate your own shadow. The healing begins when you acknowledge that your empathic gifts can be destructive when they're not conscious. Jung wrote, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed." Integration means owning your capacity for psychological manipulation, your addiction to emotional drama, and your unconscious superiority complex. This isn't about shame. It's about becoming conscious of patterns that operate automatically when you're not aware of them. Jung discovered that the shadow, once integrated, becomes a source of authentic power. Your dark empath shadow contains your capacity for healthy boundaries, appropriate selfishness, and the ability to say no without guilt. Jung's most profound insight about empathic individuation involves what I call the empathic mirror, the recognition that every person you're trying to heal is reflecting an aspect of your own psyche back to you. Jung wrote, "Everyone you meet knows something you don't know but need to know. Learn from them." This mirror effect operates through what Jung called projection and introjection, unconscious psychological processes where you cast your disowned qualities onto others and then absorb their projected material in return. Every person you feel compelled to heal carries some aspect of your own shadow or unlived potential. The wounded person who triggers your rescue response might be reflecting your own unhealed wounds. The angry person who activates your peacekeeping tendencies might be carrying the rage you've been suppressing. The narcissistic individual who exhausts your empathy might be showing you your own disowned need for attention and validation. Jung taught that empaths are unconsciously drawn to people who carry their projected shadow material. You become obsessed with healing others because you're unconsciously trying to heal the split-off parts of yourself. This is why empathic relationships often become codependent. You need others to carry your disowned psychological content, and they need you to absorb their emotional overflow. But here's Jung's revolutionary insight. Once you recognize the mirror effect, every relationship becomes an opportunity for individuation. Instead of trying to fix others, you can ask, what aspect of myself is this person reflecting? What disowned quality are they carrying for me? What unlived potential are they showing me? This shift transforms empathy from unconscious absorption to conscious reflection. You begin to see that your compulsive need to heal others is actually your psyche's attempt to integrate your own fragmented parts. Jung called this active imagination, using relationships as mirrors for self-discovery rather than projects for repair. The mirror effect also explains why certain people trigger inexplicable reactions in you. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The person whose neediness drains you might be reflecting your own disowned dependency. The individual whose anger frightens you might be carrying the rage you've been afraid to express. Integration begins when you stop trying to change others and start asking what they're teaching you about yourself. This doesn't mean becoming self-absorbed or losing your empathy. It means using your empathic sensitivity as a tool for self-discovery rather than self-abandonment. Jung understood that conscious empaths develop what he called psychological reciprocity, the ability to give and receive healing simultaneously. When you heal your own projected shadow material, you naturally help others heal theirs, not through absorption or fixing, but through authentic presence and integrated wholeness. Jung's vision of the individuated empath involves what I call the conscious sensitive, someone who has integrated their empathic gifts with authentic selfhood. Jung wrote, "The difference between a good life and a bad life is how well you walk through the fire." The conscious empath no longer loses themselves in other people's emotional states. You develop what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to feel deeply without being overwhelmed, to care without being consumed, to help without being depleted. This isn't about becoming less sensitive, it's about becoming consciously sensitive. Conscious empaths embody what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension. You can be both vulnerable and boundaried, both open-hearted and self-protective, both compassionate and discerning. You no longer see these as contradictions, but as complementary aspects of integrated empathy. Jung taught that individuation doesn't eliminate your empathic nature, it refines it. You develop what I call sacred discernment, the ability to distinguish between authentic guidance and anxious hypervigilance, between genuine intuition and projected anxiety, between healthy empathy and codependent absorption. The conscious empath serves from wholeness rather than woundedness. Jung wrote, "Where love reigns, there is no will to power, and where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking." Your service becomes an expression of your authentic self, rather than a desperate attempt to earn love or purpose through fixing others. You develop what Jung called witnessing consciousness, the ability to hold space for others' experiences without taking them on as your own. You can feel someone's pain without making it your responsibility, offer support without attachment to outcomes, love without losing yourself in the other person's psychological material. This consciousness transforms your relationships from codependent fusion to what Jung called conscious partnership. You attract people who don't need you to carry their emotional burdens, and you no longer need others to validate your worth through their healing process. The individuated empath becomes what Jung envisioned as a bridge between worlds, someone who can navigate both the emotional realm and the practical world, both spiritual sensitivity and psychological maturity, both individual authenticity and collective service. Jung understood that conscious empaths become natural leaders, not through dominance, but through integration. Your authentic presence gives others permission to be authentic. Your boundaries teach others about healthy relationships. Your self-care models how to honor sensitivity without martyrdom. The ultimate goal of Jung's empathic individuation isn't to stop being sensitive. It's to become what I call consciously empathic. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." Integration happens through what Jung called the transcendent function, moments when opposing forces within your psyche resolve into a higher synthesis. For empaths, this means integrating your need to help others with your need to honor yourself, your capacity for deep feeling with your requirement for emotional boundaries. Jung taught that transformation occurs in spirals rather than straight lines. You'll repeatedly encounter the same patterns, the urge to absorb others' pain, the compulsion to fix everyone's problems, the guilt about setting boundaries, but each time from a deeper level of consciousness. The integrated empath develops what I call emotional alchemy, the ability to transform absorbed emotional energy into conscious wisdom. Instead of being overwhelmed by others' feelings, you learn to witness them, understand their message, and respond from your authentic center rather than reactive empathy. This transformation requires what Jung called psychological death, and rebirth. Your old identity as the wounded healer, the emotional sponge, the perpetual caretaker, must die for your authentic empathic self to emerge. This process can feel terrifying because you're releasing the persona that's earned you love and purpose. But Jung discovered that on the other side of this psychological death lies what he called the birth of the self, your authentic empathic nature freed from unconscious programming and codependent patterns. You become someone who serves from strength rather than neediness, who heals from wholeness rather than woundedness. The transformation is complete when your empathy becomes a conscious choice rather than an unconscious compulsion. You can feel others' emotions without taking them on, offer support without abandoning yourself, set boundaries without guilt or drama. Jung taught that individuated empaths become what he called wounded healers who have been healed, people who can guide others through emotional difficulties because they've successfully navigated their own empathic challenges. Your sensitivity becomes a gift you offer the world from a place of wholeness rather than a burden you carry for others. Comment below, I choose conscious empathy, if you're ready to transform your sensitivity into a superpower.